So, is reducing viral load the only thing we care about when it comes to mitigating COVID-19? Ultimately, it depends, because sometimes you're going to metaphorically need a hammer, other times you need a crowbar. And that's why knowing the mechanism of action for nasal sprays and mouth rinses helps us to select the right thing for the right time. So for instance, I've been showing you that saltwater and saline mouth rinses don't really do anything for viral load. So much so that, like in the paper linked in the comment above, saline has actually been found to be an effective tool in COVID sampling collection. Because what it does is it's very good at dislodging COVID, but it also won't damage that COVID. And if you go to my YouTube channel and look at the COVID mitigation strategies and evaluating prevention measures, you'll actually see a really good paper I covered on Physium or Normal Jet, which uses an undiluted isotonic seawater nasal spray to help reduce COVID levels faster. So using that 4 times a day, 2 sprays per nostril, people were clearing the virus faster through the duration of their infection than they were if they were not doing that. And this is largely because the mechanism of action is different. As opposed to something like CPC mouthwash, where it has a staying effect and it actually kills the virus, it disrupts the membrane of the virus itself. Our metaphorical hammer that we mentioned earlier, specifically an undiluted isotonic seawater nasal spray or nasal rinse, is going to be our crowbar, which is going to essentially pull all the virus from the connecting tissue in the nostril and flush it out, which can be very helpful in the course of an entire infection duration because it prevents the COVID virions from spreading laterally and continuing to infect the surrounding tissue. So despite not actually inactivating the COVID, it can still have beneficial effects in the long term, which means that it can be an inexpensive, good alternative for something like a daily use after exposure mitigation plan, while something like iota-carrageenan or a nitric oxide nasal spray is going to be more like that hammer, where if you have an active COVID infection, that's the way you're going to want to go. Or if you've had a known really high exposure, that's also something that you would want to prefer to do. However, since those are hammers, those are tools you're not going to want to use daily because they have some cytotoxic effects. They damage the cells of your nasal tissues. So in daily use, something like a seawater nasal rinse is going to be something that's going to be more effective for the long term. But there are going to be times when you want to break out the big tools, the big guns, and use things that have a known efficacy and actually inactivating COVID and lasting for a little bit of time. But it's also very important to note that seawater is very different from saline and salt water. Seawater has a very specific pH. It's mixed with things like magnesium, potassium, and calcium, and it's well matched to the nasal environment. And it also has low salinity, so it doesn't have that much salt in it. And from the studies we've seen, and a couple more studies I'll show in the future, that's a good thing to have. And that's ultimately the difference between a prophylactic or preventative measure type tool versus when you want to bring out the big guns for things when you have an active COVID infection to help reduce the time that you're actually sick and to also prevent the disease course from becoming more severe.